Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Avodah Zara, Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, and as well much of Daf Ayin Daled. We'll be starting two lines from the bottom on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph. Let's jump right into a sugya. The Gemara says, Itmar, we learned in the Amoraim, Yain Nesech Shenafal Labor. If there was Yain Nesech, Yain that was used for Avodah Zara, that fell into a pit, V'nafal Sham Kiton Shalmaim, and as well, there was a flask of water that also fell in there. So it really depends, say the Amoraim, on the flow of events. It's not just a simple yes or no. It depends. Amar Chizkiya Higdilu be'Isser Aser, Higdilu be'Heter Muter. So according to Chizkiya, it really depends on the order in which things came in. And the Rishonim will explain it over here that when Chizkiya says Higdilu be'Isser, that that's what's going to be Aser. That was first talking about where kosher wine was there, and then there was water that was added, possibly for Miziga, and then there was Yain Nesech. That's what's going to be Aser. But if it's Higdilu be'Heter Muter, if the Yain Nesech was first and other things were there to be Mavatal, that would be Muter. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afilu Higdila Be'Isser Mutter. He held it would have been mutter under all circumstances. So if you review our case, we have Rabbi Yochanan being the big matir. Our case was where Yain Nesech fell into a board, whereas Chizkiah said that the order in which it fell in matters. According to the other shita of Rabbi Yochanan, it doesn't matter at all. And Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera Lema Chizkiah Rabbi Yochanan Beplotu to Rabbi Lotzar Barabbanan can be fligate. Perhaps, says the Gemara, that the machlokes that we see over here between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan is also similar to the machlokes that we saw earlier in this Masechta between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. This can be found on Daf Mem Tes. We learned it about a few weeks ago. It says the Gemara Ditznan. We have a Mishnah. Seor Shel Chulin. Seor Shel Chulin is basically like a yeast starter. That's what they would do. They would take sourdough and they would use it as some form of yeast for other bread. There was seor shel chulin v'shel truma. So they had starter yeast that was some of which was from chulin, which is mutter for everyone to consume, and v'shel truma some that came from truma, which not everyone can consume. Shenaflu l'socha isa, and the yeast starter from the chulin and from the truma, they both fell into isa. They fell into the dough. We're on the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, about 6-7 lines down. Now, lo bazeh kedei lechametz, v'lo bazeh kedei lechametz, v'nitztarfu v'chimtzu. The yeast that we had from the chulin was insufficient to help make more bread. Wasn't strong enough yeast. And the yeast that we had from the truma also on its own wasn't enough. Only bitseruf, the yeast from the chulin and the truma, were we able to generate anything of meaning in regards to creating more bread. Lo bazek de lechametz, lo bazek de lechametz v'nitzarfu b'chimtzu. 8 lines down on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. Here we see Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Achar achron ani ba. He says, I followed the last one. This seems similar to Chizkiah. Why? Because Chizkiah cared about the order. Here too, over here, in the case of the seor by the yeast starter from the sourdough, we see that he cares about the order. The Chachamim say, Bein shenofal iser betchila, uvein besof. Chachamim say it doesn't matter what the order is. Eino aser achi yehebok de la'achmitz. It's only true if there's enough kedei la'achmitz. So perhaps, says the Gemara, we see a link. We see party lines from the machlokes that we saw in our case between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan, where Yain Nesech was present, and there was also a keton shalmaim. And perhaps that's similar to the case of the yeast starter, where the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is that the order matters, and the Chachamim hold not that way. Says the Gemara, that's not a good svara. The Tizbara, is it even logical to say that there's a link between our case of Yain Nesech, where it fell into a bore along with a flask of water, and you want to compare that to the case of Seor Shel Chulin V'Shel Truma? After all, the Amar Abaye, and we saw this shita on Daf Mem Tes as well. According to Abaye, who says, Lo Shanu, when were we talking about the shita of Rabbi Eliezer of Achron Ani Ba? So it says the Gemara, Ela Shekadam Mesilek Yesa Isser. Even according to Rabbi Eliezer, yeah, it matters which one came first, the chulin or the truma. But he agreed that you have to take out the truma. Leisman de Pali. Yeah, you can't have the truma there. That's Pashat Aser. So therefore, he's of the opinion that it was only true if it was Kadam Mesilek Yesa Isser. Aval lo Kadam Mesilek Yesa Isser Aser. But if you don't remove the Isser, then it's going to be Aser. But that doesn't work with our case because Chizkiah to Omar Kaman. Chizkiah from our case and his words are found at the very top of this page. That when we have Yain Nesech that falls into a bor, and then we have a Kiton Shamayim that falls into a bor, and Chizkiah is specific about the order, but then there's really no match in the case of the Seor of the yeast starters because there, in the case of the yeast starters, the Isser was removed. That's not true over here. So therefore, it suggests the Gemara that we are not able to compare our case that we started with Yain Nesach that falls into a bor along with a flask of water. We cannot compare that to the case of Seor Shel Chulin V'Shel Truma because of Abaye's taich of that sugya on Daf Mem Tes, that we are talking about a case over there where the Isser was removed. That's not true in our case. We're about a third of the way down, almost a third of the way down on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. And says the Gemara, Elacha b'roin kimiflagi. No, really the machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan that we have in our case that we started with today is about roin. Rashi tells us what roin is. Rashi is about 2/3 of the way down in Rashi. Dibur hamaschil uveroin kimiflagi. And he explains as follows. Chizkiah savar lo amrinan roin es mino ki'ilu eno v'she'eno mino rabo alav umevadlo. We don't look at a min at its particular kind as though it isn't anymore. And that which is eno mino, that we say that it's rabo alav umevadlo, we don't say that. So that's bringing that back into our Gemara. Less le rowan. He doesn't hold of rowan, which Rashi just articulated for us. And the Rabbi Yochanan isle. So perhaps that's what the machlokes is, that Chizkiah doesn't hold of rowan, which is why he holds it. It's still going to be aser in our case, per his sheet at the very top of the page. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, he does hold of rowan, and therefore he would say it's mutter no matter what. We do assume that there is some kind of bittul taking place. Says the Gemara, that doesn't work either. Umi isle the Rabbi Yochanan rowan. He doesn't hold of rowan. Ravasi asked a question from Rav Yochanan that shows that Rav Yochanan doesn't hold of rowan. Shnei kosos, there's 2 cups. Echad shel chulin ve'echad shel truma. 1 cup belongs to chulin, 1 cup belongs to truma. Umazgan, and these 2 cups were diluted. Of course, their wine was extremely concentrated and strong, and they would have to add water to make it even drinkable. Be'irban zebazeh, and then the cups got merged together. It's like Sheva Brachos. You had 1 cup that the person benching had the mevarich, and now all the Sheva Brachos were on another cup. 1 was chulin and 1 was truma, and then they got mixed up. Oh, so mahu. Velo pashale. And there we see that he wasn't clear. So it seems that Rav Yochanan doesn't hold of rowan. So the Gemara says that's not a strong question because perhaps meikara lo pashadle, maybe off the cuff he didn't know the answer, but livasof pashadle, that after he looked around he found a reasonable answer, and therefore perhaps it's the case that Hitaka does hold of rowan. So therefore the Gemara, as we will soon see, concludes that we assume that the machlokas between Chizkiah and rowan and Rav Yochanan, is based on whether or not we say rowan. That according to Chizkiah, he says we don't hold of rowan. And again, Rashi explains what that means. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, he does hold of rowan. And Itmar Nami, Amar Rab Ami, Amar Rab Yochanan, Ve'amri Lo, Amar Rab Asi, Amar Rab Yochanan. One way or the other, we have a source like Rab Yochanan. The case of Beis Kosos, Echad Shel Chulen, Ve'echad Shel Truma, Mazgan, Ve'erban Zebozeh. 1 cup of Truma, 1 cup of Chulen. They were diluted with water to make them drinkable, to make them the right kind of flavor. And then they got all mixed up. Roin esaheter ki'ilu eno. So then we see the shita of Rabbi Yochanan articulated beautifully over here, which is that we see. Rowan as a heter ki, shiur mayim Rabin alavu mevatlin also. So this aligns beautifully with the shita that we saw with Rav Yochanan a little bit earlier, and as well with the Rav Yochanan that we saw on the top of this page, 2 lines down. And therefore, we have a raya that the machlokas that we have at the top of the page between Chizki and Rav Yochanan is dealing with Rowan, black on white. This last line of Idmar Nami that we just looked at, which was almost halfway down, functions kind of like a brisa, like a Tanya Nami Hachi. It's kind of like that, except that it's from the Amorai. But that brings us a perfect raya and also brings us to the 2 dots halfway down on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. The Mishnah that you would learn with Rabbi Handler stated, Ze aklal min b'mino b'mashahu, shelo b'mino b'nosein tam. Then when you're talking about min b'mino, let's say 2 different kinds of wine, so then they aser b'mashu, even if there's the slightest of mixtures, no bittul. However, shelo b'mino, if you have wine and another liquid, wine and oil, then b'nosein tam. Then we're only talking about Isser, not b'mashu, that's fine. That could be mevutal. However, when we're talking about benosein tam, so then that's the parameter of Isser, which is a little bit of a kula, because b'mashu would make something usser instantaneously, and benosein tam depends. Let's say you have something like oil, which in many cases is a very subtle flavor. So then maybe it's not benosein tam unless you have an ounce in a gallon, making it up, of course. So that's a much bigger kula because it's not going to be asa right away. However, when it comes to this particular line, we actually have a machlokas amorai. Says the Gemara, Rav and Shmuel da'amrei tarbayu. Rav and Shmuel agree they're going to be fighting against Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is ironic. Normally, Rav and Shmuel argue. Normally, Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan argue. Here, each of the Baalei Plukta who generally argue with one another are friends. So Rabbi Shmuel da Amrit Arbayu, Kol Isurin Shabbat Torah b'minon b'mashu, shelo b'minon b'nosein tam. In general, when we're talking about min b'mino, we assume that the Isser is b'mashu. So if I have a little bit of truma wine that gets mixed into even a lot of bit of chulin wine, it would aser it because it's aser b'mashu. Shelo b'minon b'nosein tam, which was like we saw. Now, that Mishnah had said the phrase zehaklal le'asuye mai, le'asuye kol isurin sheba Torah. That teaches us to broaden this idea to kol isurin sheba Torah. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish Tamrei Tarbayu, they had a little bit of a different perspective. They said kol isurin sheba Torah, that in general, when we talk about isur in the Torah, bein b'minon, bein shelo b'minon, whether or not it is 2 things that are similar or 2 things that are different. 2 things that are similar would be 2 different kinds of wine, one usr, one mutter. That would be two things that are very similar. 2 things that are not similar is wine and oil. Really, all of them, they hold, are benosein tam. Really, our bigger concern is benosein tam, and bittul would work up to the point of benosein tam. But once nosein tam kicks in, then Minat Torah, you're stuck, and there's no way to get out of that problem. It says the Gemara, Chutz mitevel v'yayin nesech. The exception to this rule that we use nosein tam is with tevel, which is untithed food, and v'yayin nesech, which is wine that was used for avodah Zara purposes. And when it comes to those 2 things of tevel and yayin nesech, b'minon b'mashahu, they hold that if it's the same type of tevel within tevel or yain nesech within yain nesech, so then it's going to be usher even b'mashahu, even without any bittul, 1 to 1,000 units, 1 to 10,000 units, there's no bittul. V'shelo b'minan b'nosein tam. And when we're talking about 2 things that are not exactly the same, again, wine and oil, so then says the Gemara, then we follow the rules of nosein tam. So fundamentally, Rav and Shmuel say that the baseline of Chumash is that b'minon b'mashu shelo b'minon b'nosein tam. And Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish hold that the baseline is no, both of them are b'nosein tam with the exception of tevel and yain nesech. How then do Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish learn the V'zeh HaKlal? So says the Gemara beautifully, Hazeh HaKlal le'asuye tevel. It's a chiddush dekadin that we're coming to learn about the laws of tevel. Because tevel and yain nesach are very different. And we'll ask shortly why it is that those two things were lumped together, because they really are not quite the same. And about 12 lines from the bottom of the page, the Gemara brings brisas like both of the approaches that we saw, both like the approach of Rav and Shmuel, that the baseline of the Torah is that min bimino is going to be aser b'mashu, and shelo bimino will be aser b'no sein tam. We'll see a brisa like that. And we'll also see a brisa like Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish that really everything is b'no sein tam. So let's see these brisas. Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Shmuel and Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Shmuel Kol Isurin Sheba Torah b'minan b'mashu shelo b'minan b'no sein tam. Black on white. So we see that this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel has its roots in the Tanaim. And Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. We have a brisa that supports the shita Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish as well. That kol isurin shebat Torah bein b'minan bein shelo b'minan b'no sein tam. They hold that really fundamentally the baseline of the Torah is that whether or not it's the same thing min b'mino or something different min b'she'eno mino, really it's b'no sein tam. Chutz mitevel v'yayin nesech b'minan b'mashu shelo b'minan b'no sein tam. Very good. So that's the end of really the first part of this piece of Gemara that we started at the halfway point, and that is to say that we have a broad machlokas between Rav and Shmuel on the one side and Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish on the other as to what is the baseline of Isser. According to Rav and Shmuel, we distinguish between min b'mino, where it's aser b'mashu, and min shelo b'mino, which is aser only b'no sein tam. Masha'en kain, according to the shita of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, where they hold not that way. They hold that really everything is b'no sein tam with some exceptions. So now the Gemara, as mentioned earlier, is going to pick up on a concern. 5 lines from the bottom on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, says the Gemara as follows. Bishlama yain nesech mishum chumra de avodas kochavim. I understand why the Chachamim, why it wanted to make things even more difficult. Again, this is all within the camp of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish to say that when it comes to Tevel and Yain Nesech, that b'minon it's b'mashu. I understand with Yain Nesech, Mishum Chumra de Avodas Kol Chavim, I totally get that. But why Tevel? Aval Tevel, Ela Tevel, my timer. Why is it that we needed to be so makbid on Tevel? There's plenty of Isurim. Why did we pick these Isurim? Why did we pick Tevel to be similar to Yain Nesech? So it says the Gemara as follows. Ela Tevel my timer, kehetero kach isuro. That which is matir the Tevel, that's how we therefore have to treat the Tevel in the Isser side of things. What that means is the Omar Shmuel, chita achas poteres esakri, that one little stalk of wheat, one kernel of wheat could be given in order to pater the Tevel. That's midoraisa. The Chachamim were machmer. We had different amounts, 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th. But midoraisa, technically speaking, if a person were to give even one chita, one kernel of wheat, they would have been pater. So therefore, that's how we have to say that it's going to be on the tzad shel iser. You're right. It's really different than yain nesech. Yain nesech in general is more chamer. And the reason why we're machmer by yain nesech isn't because of this svara of kehetero kachisuro. It's just because we're very, very makbid by yain nesech. There's just a unique chiddush dekadin when it comes to the world of tevel, the kehetero kachisuro, that because the way we pater a kri, the whole mound of the kernels of wheat is even with one kernel midoraisa, then it's no longer tevel. Kach, that's how we get to the level of iser when it comes to the chita. And interestingly, the syntax is uncommon, but it should not say v'tanya nami hachi. It should say v'tnan nami hachi, which is very uncommon syntax. We're not used to that. But the Gemara says, based on a Mishnah in Maseches Chala, Bameh Amru Tevel Oser B'Kolshu B'Mino, and Shelo B'Mino B'no Sein Tam. Here we see this idea The tevel is the same exact as yain nesech, same exact thing. And this is all within the camp of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who, while in general they hold that Isurim Shabbat Torah, whether or not they're min b'mino or min b'she'eno mino, we don't care. Usually the rule is that they're aser b'nosein tam, and we seem to paskin this way in Shulchan Aruch because the other cases have no bittul. The fact that we have bittul is because we paskin like Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Obviously, if there's so much cheese in the chalent, even if it's batel b'shishim, but it mamish tastes like Parmesan, you're in big trouble that you can't eat, even if it's batel b'shishim. But the only way we could have bittul, according to the Gemara within min b'mino, is only if we hold like Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So they made the exceptions to be yain nesech and tevel. And look at this line. Amru tevel aser b'kol b'mino. This is exactly what we saw. But shelo b'mino, when things are not exactly the same min, then b'nosei tam, the regular rules of bittul apply up until that upper limit of when we have nosei tam. We'll learn all of this Amud and about half of Ayin Daled Amud Beis, and then we'll stop for the night and Emir Hashem pick up and catch up tomorrow. For those of you who have yet to send in their payment for our siyum, Emir Hashem will have a double siyum on Tuesday night for Maseches Shavuos, which we never made, and for Avodah Zara. In the meantime, let's start a new Mishnah on the top of Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says, Elu Osrim, Elu Asurim, excuse me, the Osrim Bekolshu. These are Asr, meaning these are Asr Behana, and they are also Osir Bekolshu. Let's take a look at Rashi that gives us a really nice framing for our Mishnah. Rashi at the top of the page, Dibra Maschel Masnisan Elu Asurin Ve'osrin Bekolshu. Kol Makom Shenis Arvu Sham, Afilu Echad Be'elef Lo Batil. Whenever you're dealing with something that even when it's 1 in 1,000, it's not nullified, the Osrin Eskulan, it also ruins everything else. So says the Gemara, what is the laundry list of items that fall into this category? So says the Gemara, let's look at a whole list. Yain Nesech is number 1, wine that was used in libations for Avodah Zara. The Avodas Kochavim, a pesel of some kind. Rashi says, a tzura she'avduha. There was a pesel that was served. V'nis arva be'elef tzuros she'enan avodas kochavim. And it got lost with many other tzuros that were not yet served. Rashi, back in the Gemara, va'oros levuvin. You may recall that there was a particular avodah zara where they would cut the skin right opposite the heart and then reach inside and remove the heart from the animal while otherwise the animal was still alive, which is a shocking thing to see. But it was some form of avodah zara. So the oros levuvin, once those skins were used, it's aser b'ana because it was part of the avodas kochavim. That's pasha. We know that avodas kochavim is aser b'ana. So if those oros levuvin would have gotten mixed into other oros that were not levuvin, just other hides, so that would be aser. The shor haniskal we know is aser b'ana. We've seen in Shas many times. The egla arufa, we've seen the same principle here many times as well. V'tzipore mitzora, v'se'ar nazir, u'peter chamor, u'basar b'chalav, u's'ira mishtaleach, v'chulna shenishchetu be'azara. So this is the laundry list of elu asurin, things that are asur behana, and they're osurin bekolshu. Says the Gemara, if you look first, it says elu asurin ve'asur bekolshu, told us that, and then look at the next language, hare elu asurin ve'osurin bekolshu. So we're obviously seeing the same exact principle twice. It said in the beginning it's asur, and says in the end it's asur. We'll discuss that in the Gemara. So on Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, the Gemara continues 6 lines down and says, Tana Maiko Choshev. What is the common thread? What is the common denominator of all of the things in our Mishnah that are Asur Behana? So he was bothered. He's trying to figure out what is the Seder HaDvarim? Why is it that you picked these and not other things? What is common to all of the things in the list, starting with Yain Nesech and going all the way through to Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'ad Zara? Zags the Gemara as follows. If what your common denominator is, it is davar shebeminyan. Rashi's 2/3 of the way down. Dibra Maskil Idavar shebemin kachash mishum dedarko limanovas. These things are the kinds of things that we count. We have one oros levuvin, we have two chulun shenishchatu be'azara. If there are things that we count, so Rashi says mishum dedarko limanos lo batil. If that's true, if your common denominator is things that are typically counted, then listening nami chatichos nevela. You're right that it's not aser be'ana. But if what's common to all of these things is that they're darker than lihimanos, then we should also have chatichos nevela. And isure hanaka chashiv. If what you're saying is that the common denominator is only that which is aser be'ana, listening not mechametz b'Pesach. We know chametz b'Pesach. If you had chametz be'Isser on Pesach, we know that that's also aser be'ana. Yet it's not found in this Mishnah. So the Gemara is struggling to find the thread that that weaves together all of the examples that are in our Mishnah. So Amar Reb Chia bar Abba v'itema Rav Yitzchak nafcha. Hai Tana tarte isle. He says, the common denominators in our Mishnah is both of these things. Davar shebeminyan ve'isure hana. Now the Gemara finds its punchline. The Gemara says that the common denominators of our Mishnah is something that's davar shebeminyan, namely, as you to borrow Rashi's language, it's something that's darko limanos, and also something that's aser be'ana. So we would have thought, therefore, that our Mishnah is therefore exhaustive. Our Mishnah says that all of these things are going to be asurin ve'asur b'kol shehu. And now we know that it's darkan limanos is parameter number 1, and that it's asur be'anos parameter number 2. So says the Gemara, v'lisnei egoze perech v'rimone badon. Maybe we should say that egoze perech, they're from, Rashi says they're from a particular place. Perech is a makom, v'chein rimone badon. So says the Gemara, im shel orlo shel kiloya kerem, Rashi says, hein, v'nis arbu be'elev kulan yidlaku, they should all be consumed. Why don't we include this as well? It's darkan limanos, it's davar shebeminyan, and it's also aser be'ana. The davar shebeminyan b'surano. So says the Gemara, you're absolutely right. Technically, we could have added it, except for one thing. It was already added somewhere else. Says the Gemara, Tanale Hasam. This was already taught somewhere else. This was taught in Mishnais and Orla, also quoted early on in Beit, as you can see in the Mar Makomos there. So we already know from that Mar Makom that Egoze Perech and Rimone Badon that were Orla, which granted our Davar Shebeminyan and Aser Be'ana. You're right, they belong in our Mishnah. The only reason they're not there is because they were already included. So the Gemara continues cheppering and trying to find out other things that maybe could have been brought in our Mishnah. Why don't we bring the loaves of bread of a balabais as it relates to chametz on Pesach? That's what the Gemara wants to suggest. Rashi adds in the language that was added in the previous case, but not here, which is the davar shebeminyan v'isure hana. So the Gemara says, Man shamas damar le, who holds this way? Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, if Rabbi Akiva holds this way, it should be added in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, no. Otana le hasam, Rabbi Akiva mosif afki kolosh shel balabais. We do have it added. Don't worry, all is fine and good. And therefore, the Gemara has now concluded that the theme of our Mishnah, all of the items listed in our Mishnah, have two things that are true about them. They're davar shebeminyan. They're dvarms that are darkan limanos that are typically counted. How many oros levuvin do you have? How many agla arufas do you have? How many seir nazirs do you have? Chulei? And they're also all aser be'ana. So then the Gemara picks up on what I foreshadowed earlier about Hare Elu. Why is it that the Mishnah that at the top of this page on Ayin Daled Amud Aleph started out by saying that they're Asurin, Osrin, and then at the end of the Mishnah it said Hare Elu Asurin ve'Osrin? We only need you to tell us once. We don't need you to tell us twice. So why is it that our Mishnah has a duplicative language around the framing of that which is Asur? The Gemara says, "L'ma'ute mai." What is this coming to teach me? Ma'ute davar shebeminyan v'lav isure hana. So the Gemara says it's coming to teach us a similar principle. We're just doubling down. that we're not going to have things in our Mishnah that are asurin and osrin, that even if they're davar sheva minyan, but they're not asur behana, or inami lemuute usuri hana velo davar sheva minyan, or if something is asur behana, but it's not a davar sheva minyan, that also doesn't qualify for our Mishnah to be asurin the osrin. Beautiful. So a clean Mishnah, a clean Gemara. Let's continue. We're two-thirds of the way down on Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Yain nesech shenafal lebor. If there's yain nesech that falls into a pit, and we're assuming now that it's a pit of kosher wine, so that's min bimino, kulo asar behana, whole thing's asar behana. Rashbag Omer, yimacher kulo lo'ove kochavim. No, it's not asar behana. It can be sold to an ove kochavim, chutz midmei yain nesech shabo, minus the cost of actual yain nesech. So let's put some dollar amounts. Let's say I have a barrel. My barrel is worth $10,000 of wine, and somebody spills in $100 of yain nesech. According to the Tanakhama of our Mishnah, he held it's kulo aser ba'ana, you're done. But according to Rashbag, he says you are taka allowed to sell it to a goy. But of the $10,000 of wine, and we added another 100 of yain nesech, you cannot sell 10,100. That's not allowed. You're not allowed to sell the dmei, the value of the yain nesech that was added. That's what the Gemara says. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav halacha kerashbag chavis bechavis aval lo yain beyain. When is it that we hold like Rashbag? That's not all an actual mixed barrel of wine like the case I gave. No. The case I gave, Taka, wouldn't be true according to Rashbag. Rather, it's chavis bechavis. I have 100 barrels, and now I have 101 barrels. I know one is yain nesech. I just don't know which one. There, Rashbag would say it's mutter to sell them all, minus the value of the one barrel of yain nesech. Avar yain v'yain, avar lo yain v'yain. But we would not agree that if the yain nesech was poured directly into the kosher wine, Rashbag would not agree that that's mutter. Everyone would agree that that's aser be'ana. Ushmuel Amar, afilu yain beyain. He's a big mekel. He says that that's not true. Rashbag would even agree if it was yain beyain. Uchein Amar Rabba Bar Barchan Amar Rav Yochanan afilu yain beyain. These Amoraim also agreed that, according to the Shita of Rashbag, that even if yain nesech was poured into kosher wine, it would be mutter to sell, not to drink. V'chein Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Nasan Amar Rav Chanina afilu yain beyain. V'chein Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Avua afilu yain beyain. Everyone seems to agree. Amar Rav Nachman, halacha l'maisa, he's going to paskin for us. Yain nesech, yain beyain aser chavis bechavis mutter. So he seems to hold not like most of these Amoraim, but rather like Rav, who was the first of them. However, stam yenam should say yenam over here, not stam yain. If you look on the side over here, it corrects it to yenon with a nun at the end, two nuns at the end. The Gemara says that when it comes to stam yenon, afilu yain beyain mutter, that's not a problem to sell at all. That would be allowed. So we seem to paskin not like the majority of the Amoraim, but rather like Rav and like Rav Nachman, that when it comes to yain nesech, if it's yain b'yain, then we say it's completely aser b'anon, it cannot be sold. But if it were to be chavios, that would be mutter to sell. Masha'en kain with stam yenon, there we would say that it's perfectly mutter to sell them. Of course, you can't eat them, but with stam yenon, if it got mixed in with kosher or wine, you are allowed to sell that. There is no iser hana. That brings us to the top of Ayin Daled on the base. Let's learn for a handful more of minutes just to get to halfway down the page, and then we'll stop. Gas shel Evan. We have a vat that's made out of stone. Shezif ove kochavim. That was it was coated with pitch by an ove kochavim. So what they would typically do is, because the pitch had such a difficult smell, they would add a little bit of wine to offset the smell. So the halacha is minagba vihi tehora. They would have to literally the word menagba means to dry it, but that's not what it means here. And Rashi does tell us what it means. Menagba, second line. Mefarish begemara b'mayim ve'efer. They would use water and ash. It was some type of scrub that they would use to remove the flavoring of the wine. That was true if it was a gas shel evan. However, if it was a gas shel eitz, if it was wooden, then Rabbi Omer Yina gave, he said we could still apply the same rules, that it just had to be scrubbed with this water and ash. V'chachamim omrim, or on ayin dalet at base 3 lines down, yiklof es hazefes, you have to completely peel off the pitch. The pitch that you put on that has wine in it, it all solidified just like tar would. You mamish have to peel off the whole thing back down to the wood, or back down to the stud in our parlance. However, Rishel Cheres, had it been that the gas was not made out of stone, and it wasn't even made out of eitz, but rather it was made out of pottery, because we know that pottery is very absorptive, and therefore, even if it was covered in pitch, we assume that wine would have been absorbed even more deeply, even into the container. And here we have 2 lines of Rava that are a little difficult to understand. Amar Rava, dafka zafsa. That's only true if there's pitch. Aval darach ba lo. But had it been that we're not talking about the pitch anymore. Let's say there was no pitch. Let's say that there was just it was just pressed grapes by a goy. So lo. So that would not work. Says the Gemara, pshita. I know. Zafsa tanat. That's what our Mishnah said. That we're only talking about a case of pitch. We're not talking about a case of where it's pressed directly. Says the Gemara, Ma'udatema, you might have thought, that perhaps we can say that we can use niguv, this scrubbing process with mayim and afer. Zafsa was common. That's what they did to waterproof it. Kamash Malanda. That's not true. Zafsa was dafka. And if a guy were to be dores grapes, it would not be enough to use niguv, to use mayim and afer to clean it out. And ika de amre. Some say another version of Rava. We're about 10 lines down on ayin daled amud beis. That Amar Rava dafka zafsa. We're talking about specifically when there was zefes. Aval darach ba. But if the guy had pressed olives in it, lo sagi le beniguv. Niguv isn't even enough. Says the Gemara pshita. We know that's true. After all, zafsa tznan. Says the Gemara, no. Mao de tema, you might have thought that hu adin de afilu darach ba, that even had it been that there was darach ba, that maybe niguv is enough. But perhaps we would have said that it's insufficient for niguv kamash malan. So here we have a difference between the 2 approaches of Rava. One, in the first approach, we would not allow to use niguv in regards to darachba, where it was pressed without pitch, and in the second case, we would. And a little bit of a story to close out the day. Ki hahud de'asa lekame de Reb Chia. Someone came in front of Reb Chia. Amar le hav li gabra de dachi li ma'atzartoi. I need someone to help kasher my wine press. Kashering is unique. Normally, we think about heat when we talk about kashering something. So here, the Gemara says that someone went to Rav Chia and said, "Hey, can you please help send someone who knows halacha very well and help them to have them help me to kasher my wine press?" So says the Gemara, Amar le Rab. Rav Chia says to Rab, Zil b'hadeh. He says to Rab, you're a big Talmud Chacham. Go figure it out. You go work with them. You know the halachos well. V'chazi delo mitzavchas ale be'medrasha. And Rav Chia says to Rab, do a good job so that people don't complain about things in the base medrash. I don't want any complaints. Do it perfectly. So Azal, Rab was a good student. Chazi dahava shiat tvei. He saw that it was extremely smooth. So Omar, what he thought to say was, Havadai beniguf sagile. Regular scrubbing will work. We'll take our water-ash mixture. We'll clean out the gas. We'll clean out the wine press. And Shalom al Yisrael, everything is going to be okay. However, Bahadi de Ka'azil v'asim. while Rav was walking around and looking at the gas and looking at the wine press, Chaza Pila, he actually saw that there was a crack in the wine press. We've seen this word many times in Shabbos. And the word Pila means that there's a crack. V'chaza Pila mituse, v'chaza dahava malech amra. He saw that there was a crack and that a lot of wine had gotten stuck inside that particular crack. Omar, he said, Halo saki labaniguv elabakiluf. I'm sorry, I can't do the regular scrubbing. It's insufficient in this case because there's a crack. And therefore, what we need to do is kiluf. V'hainu da'amar le chavivi. Chazi de lo metzav chasalai be'medrasha. This was the musar. This was the message that Rav Chia was giving to Rab. Please, if you're going to go out there and do some work for me, you're going to be a mashgiach on my behalf, says Rav Chia to Rab. Make sure nobody complains. So that's what the Gemara says he did, and he did a very good job. He found a crack. He knew that regular niguv wouldn't work of maim and efer, because there was a crack taka that broke through the zefes, that broke through the pitch, and therefore he couldn't rely on niguv anymore. He had to do kiluv. We'll stop right here. Emir Hashem will pick up with Tanu Rabbanon tomorrow night, halfway down on Ayin Dalet Amud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.